It hovers over your evening primrose or your honeysuckle in broad daylight, wings being so fast they blur into a soft haze, a long, thin tongue unfurling and dipping deep into each blossom before it darts backward and sideways to the next flower, moving with precision and speed that looks, at a passing glance, almost exactly like a hummingbird. Most people, seeing this for the first time, assume they're watching some unusually small, unusually colorful species of hummingbird, or failing that, a particularly large and fast butterfly, and either reaction leads to the same outcome. Mild delight, followed by no concern whatsoever, since neither hummingbirds nor butterflies carry the reflexive unease so many people feel toward moths in general. Here's what almost nobody realizes in that moment. What you're actually watching is a moth, a genuine, true moth, part of the exact insect group most people associate with dusty, unwelcome visitors bumping against a porch light at night, not with the elegant, celebrated daytime pollinators drifting gracefully from flower to flower in your garden. And the gap between how people actually feel about moths in general and how they react to this specific one reveals something worth understanding about an entire badly misunderstood category of insects hiding in plain sight throughout your garden. Today, we're going to explain exactly what you're looking at, why it defies almost everything people assume about moths as a group, and why moths, broadly, deserve considerably more credit and considerably less reflexive aversion than they typically receive. Let's start by properly identifying what's actually hovering over your flowers, because this specific insect is remarkable for how consistently it gets mistaken for two entirely different animals, neither of which it's actually related to at all. What you're mostly observing is a member of the Sphinx moth family, and within that family, specifically one of the hummingbird moths or clearwing moths, genera like Himaris, species specifically adapted to daytime feeding in a manner that converges really closely through an evolutionary process called convergent evolution, with the feeding behavior of actual hummingbirds, despite the two group as distantly related as two animals can be, one an insect and the other a bird. The confusion with hummingbirds stems directly from genuine physical and behavioral similarities that aren't accidental. Both hummingbird moths and actual hummingbird are in place while feeding. Both rely on rapid wing beats, invisible to the naked eye at normal viewing distance. And both possess an elongated feeding structure, a proboscis in the moth's case, a long, specialized beak and tongue in the hummingbirds, adapted specifically to reach deep into tubular flowers inaccessible to most other pollinators. This is a textbook example of convergent evolution, in which two unrelated organisms independently evolve similar physical solutions to the same ecological challenge, in this case, efficiently accessing nectar from deep, narrow flower structures while hovering rather than landing. The confusion with butterflies, meanwhile, stems from a different and in some ways more understandable source. Both moths and butterflies belong to the same broader insect order, Lepidoptera, sharing a genuinely close evolutionary relationship, unlike the hummingbird comparison. But despite this shared ancestry, moths and butterflies represent two distinct branches within that order, with several reliable physical differences separating them, differences this specific hovering moth displays clearly once you know what to look for. Since the title of this video specifically addresses the butterfly confusion, it's worth covering the reliable distinguishing features clearly, since they apply not just to this specific hovering species, but to moths and butterflies more broadly. Check. Antennae. Butterflies almost universally have thin, thread-like antennae, ending in a distinct, small club or bulb at the tip. Moths display considerably more antenna variation across species, but the majority feature either feathery, comb-like antennae, particularly pronounced in males of many species, or simple thread-like antennae that taper without the distinct club-shaped butterflies display, a difference visible with reasonably close observation even without magnification. Check the body shape and covering. Moths, including the hummingbird moth species discussed here, typically have noticeably thicker, fuzzier, more robust bodies covered in dense, hair-like scales, an adaptation that, among other functions, helps many moth species retain body heat, particularly relevant for species active during cooler parts of the day or during nighttime hours when ambient temperature drops considerably. Butterflies generally display more slender, smoother bodies by comparison. Check the wing at rest. Butterflies typically fold their wings together vertically above their body when resting, while moths generally hold their wings flat, tented, or spread out to the sides when at rest, though this specific distinguishing feature is admittedly less useful for hovering species like the hummingbird moth, which rarely lands and folds its wings in the way a resting butterfly typically does. Check the general activity pattern, while remembering this specific case is the exception that proves the rule. The vast majority of moth species are primarily nocturnal, active during evening and nighttime hours, which is precisely why moths are so strongly associated with porch lights and evening activity in general, while the vast majority of butterfly species are exclusively diurnal, active only during daylight hours. The hummingbird moth specifically defies this general pattern by being diurnal itself, one of a genuinely notable minority of moth species that has evolved daytime activity, which is precisely why it gets mistaken for a butterfly or a hummingbird so consistently, despite being, in every meaningful taxonomic sense, a moth first and foremost. Given that the overwhelming majority of moth species are nocturnal, it's worth understanding why hummingbird moths specifically evolved to break from this pattern, since the explanation connects directly to the same hovering, nectar-feeding behavior that makes them so easily confused with hummingbirds in the first place. Researchers studying the evolutionary history of daytime moth species within the broader Sphingidae family, that daytime activity in these specific lineages likely developed in connection with a feeding on flowers that are themselves more accessible, more visually conspicuous, or produce more concentrated nectar rewards during daylight hours, allowing these particular moth species to access a nectar resource with less direct competition from the many exclusively nocturnal moth species also competing for nectar from night-blooming flowers during evening hours. This represents a genuine ecological niche shift, trading the reduced predation risk many nocturnal insects benefit from under cover of darkness for access to a daytime nectar resource with comparatively less direct competition from other moths specifically. This shift also required corresponding adaptations beyond simple activity timing, including the kind of rapid, sustained hovering flight capability that allows these moths to feed efficiently from a flower without needing to land. While metabolically demanding, provides genuine advantages when feeding from flowers with limited landed surface area or from flowers in ways that make landing impractical, advantages that likely reinforce the evolutionary pressure toward the specific hovering behavior these species now display so distinctly. This is where the story extends beyond a single misidentified species and into a broader point worth making about moths generally, since the reflexive aversion so many people feel toward moths, an aversion this specific hovering species conveniently avoids simply by not looking or acting like what people expect a moth to be, is considerably less justified than most people assume. Moths represent a genuinely enormous, ecologically vital pollinator group, with estimates suggesting there are considerably more moth species worldwide than butterfly species, often cited at a ratio of roughly 10 moth species for every one butterfly species, despite butterflies receiving the overwhelming majority of positive public attention and conservation interest by comparison. Nocturnal moths' specific outsized role in pollinating blooming flowers, plant species that have specifically a pale coloring, strong evening fragrance, and nectar production time to overnight obviously because they rely primarily on moths, rather than daytime pollinators like bees and butterflies, for successful reproduction, meaning an entire category of plant life ecosystems depends almost entirely on moth activity that occurs while most people are in asleep, invisible to the vast majority of casual observers who form their entire impression of moths from occasional porch light encounters instead. Beyond pollination, represent one of the most significant food sources for backyard bird populations, particularly in the spring and early summer. Breeding bird species specifically require large quantities of soft-bodied caterpillar protein to successfully raise their young. A dietary dependency researchers studying bird conservation have specifically documented as considerably more significant than many people realize, given how much public attention tends to focus on area availability rather than the caterpillar population's quietly sustaining nesting bird success behind the scenes. It's worth directly addressing the specific association most responsible for moths' poor general reputation, since it's almost certainly the primary reason most people, encountering an ordinary nocturnal moth rather than the daytime hovering species discussed above, react with instinctive discomfort rather than the same casual interest they'd show a butterfly, or, as covered above, this specific hummingbird moth species. The tendency of many moth species to gather persistently around artificial lights at night, a behavior called positive phototaxis, is not evidence of aggression, attraction to humans specifically, or any behavior remotely connected to actual harm. The leading scientific explanation for this behavior involves the disruption of a navigation system many nocturnal insects rely on, using the moon and stars as fixed, distant reference points to maintain a consistent flight direction, a system that becomes confused and disoriented when an artificial light source, positioned much closer than any celestial body for that same kind of fixed reference point, causing the moth to circle repeatedly in an attempt to maintain what its navigation system interprets as a straight flight path relative to the light. This means the swarm of moths circling your porch light isn't evidence of some unusual, unsettling attraction to your home specifically. It's evidence of a navigation system, refined over tens of millions of years around a reliable, distant celestial reference point, being genuinely confused by a relatively recent human invention never evolved to account for. An explanation less unsettling and considerably more sympathetic than the vague unease most people feel without ever understanding the actual mechanism behind it. Given the ecological role covered above, there's a genuine practical case for actively supporting rather than simply tolerating moth activity in your own garden, beyond the specific hovering species that prompted this video in the first place. Consider incorporating night-blooming or pale-colored, fragrant flowers into your garden plantings. Species like evening primrose, moonflower, night-blooming jasmine, which specifically support nocturnal moth pollinators that most daytime-focused garden tends to overlook entirely, creating a meaningful pollinator resource during hours when most other garden pollinator activity has already concluded for the day. Avoid excessive outdoor lighting, or use warmer-toned, motion-activated lighting instead of continuous bright white light, since research on moth conservation has specifically widespread artificial lighting, sometimes referred to as light pollution in this specific ecological context, meaningfully disrupts moth navigation, feeding and mating behavior across broad areas, contributing to documented moth population declines in several well-studied regions. A genuinely significant conservation concern given the pollination and food web roles covered above. Recognize caterpillars found on garden plants aren't automatically acquiring removal, since as covered above, a meaningful portion of caterpillar activity ultimately supports both future moth pollinations and the local bird populations that depend heavily on caterpillar protein during breeding season, a broader ecological value worth weighing against the relatively minor, often cosmetic plant damage caterpillars typically cause in a home garden setting. If you've spotted a hovering, hummingbird-like insect on your flowers and want to confirm and appreciate what you're actually looking at, here's a simple, practical approach. Observe from a comfortable distance rather than approaching closely or attempting to catch it. Hummingbird moths are genuinely harmless, possessing no sting or bite capable of affecting a human, but close, sudden movement will simply cause it to move on to another flower or area of the garden, ending your observation opportunity prematurely. Look specifically for the identifying features covered earlier: the fuzzy, robust body, the visible proboscis extended forward during feeding, and the rapid, sustained hover rather than the more variable, often fluttering flight pattern typical of most butterfly species, to confirm you're looking at this specific moth rather than an actual hummingbird or butterfly. Consider photographing it if you're interested in species-level identification, since several distinct hummingbird moth species exist across different regions, each with somewhat different coloring and size, and a photograph allows for more detailed identification afterward without requiring you to disturb or approach the insect directly during its feeding activity. Leave it entirely undisturbed to continue feeding, recognizing that it's actively providing genuine pollination value to your garden in that exact moment. Precisely the same practical conclusion reached in the earlier video on this channel discussing bee flies. The insect hovering gracefully over your flowers in broad daylight occupies a strange, genuinely interesting position. A true moth that has evolved so convincingly like both a hummingbird and, by extension in most casual observers' minds, a butterfly, that it manages to entirely escape the reflexive unease most people feel toward its own broader taxonomic group. An unease that, as covered throughout this video, was never particularly well justified toward ordinary nocturnal moths in the first place. Somewhere, hovering visitor at your daytime flowers, and the considerably less celebrated moth circling your porch light after dark lies the same fundamental insect. for pollinating a significant share of life in nearly every ecosystem on Earth and sustaining bird populations through an entire breeding season, deserving, by any honest accounting of its actual ecological contribution, considerably more appreciation than its reputation currently affords it. Have you ever mistaken a hummingbird moth for an actual hummingbird in your own garden? Now that you know the truth, does it change how you feel about the moths circling your porch light at night too? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and sometimes your stories become the subject of the next video. And if you've ever wondered what another small creature quietly living in your garden actually knows about your world, I think the next video might surprise you just as much as this one did. Until then, keep watching, keep wondering, and never stop paying attention to the small things.